As national economies approached a certain level of per capita income, growing middle classes would demand legal and political power, which rulers would have to grant if they wanted their nations to prosper. Since democratic capitalism was the most successful model for developing societies, all societies would eventually choose that path. In the battle of ideas, liberalism had triumphed. As Francis Fukuyama famously put it, "At the end of history, there are no serious ideological competitors left to liberal democracy." The economic and ideological determinism of the early post-Cold War years produced two broad assumptions that shaped both policies and expectations. One was an abiding belief in the inevitability of human progress, the belief that history moves in only one direction, a faith born in the Enlightenment, dashed by the brutality of the 20th century, but given new life by the fall of communism. The other was a prescription for patience and restraint. Rather than confront and challenge autocracies, it was better to enmesh them in the global economy, support the rule of law and the creation of stronger state institutions, and let the ineluctable forces of human progress work their magic. With the world converging around the shared principles of Enlightenment liberalism, the great task of the post-Cold War era was to build a more perfect international system of laws and institutions, fulfilling the prophecies of Enlightenment thought stretching back to the 17th and 18th centuries. A world of liberal governments would be a world without war, just as Kant had imagined. The free flow of both goods and ideas in the new globalized era would be an antidote to human conflict. As Montesquieu had argued, the natural effect of commerce is to lead toward peace. This old Enlightenment dream seemed suddenly possible because, along with the apparent triumph of international liberalism, the geopolitical and strategic interests of the world's great powers also seemed to converge. In 1991, President George H.W. Bush spoke of a New World Order, in which the nations of the world, East and West, North and South, can prosper and live in harmony, where the rule of law supplants the rule of the jungle, where nations recognize the shared responsibility for freedom and justice. It was a world quite different from the one we've known. The world looked different primarily because the Soviet Union was different. No one would have suggested that history had ended if the communist Soviet Union had not so suddenly and dramatically died and been transformed after 1989. The transformation of Soviet and then Russian foreign policy was remarkable. The peaceful influence of liberal ideas completely reoriented Russian perspectives on the world, or so it seemed. Even in the last years of the Cold War, advocates of new thinking in Moscow called for convergence and the breakdown of barriers between East and West, a common embrace, as Mikhail Gorbachev put it, of universal values. Then, in the early Yeltsin years, under Foreign Minister Andrei Kozyrev, Russia appeared committed to entering postmodern Europe. Moscow no longer defined its interests in terms of territory and traditional spheres of interest, but rather in terms of economic integration and political development. It renounced regional hegemony, withdrew troops from neighboring states, slashed defense budgets, sought alliance with the European powers and the United States, and in general shaped its foreign policies on the premise that its interests were the same as those of the West. Russia's wish was simply to belong. The democratization of Russia, beginning even in the Gorbachev years, had led the country's leaders to redefine and recalculate Russia's national interests. Moscow could give up imperial control in Eastern Europe, could give up its role as a superpower, not because the strategic situation had changed. If anything, the United States was more menacing in 1985 than it had been in 1975, but because the regime in Moscow had changed. A democratizing Russia did not fear the United States or the enlargement of its alliance of democracies. If Russia could abandon traditional great power politics, so could the rest of the world. The age of geopolitics has given way to an age of what might be called geoeconomics, Martin Walker wrote in 19...